How much actual hockey could you learn about from the Heated Rivalry television show, which is about two gay hockey players who fall in love? Shockingly to some, but not at all shockingly to me, a ton. If you've been following along, you know that we have been breaking down the hockey context in the series Heated Rivalry episode by episode. And now we have finally come to episode 6, which is The Cottage. Now this episode was highly requested, but also one that a lot of people seem to think there wasn't enough hockey to talk about for a full episode. And I have to tell you, this episode has so much hockey context in it that I think it really brings their love story together in a way that is just so beautiful, but also shows how much this show really understands the sport and how much it uses the sport in order to actually build this relationship between Shane and Ilia in a way that is so lasting and so impactful. If you're new to this channel, I'm Marissa, and I break down sports and culture in a way that I think opens it up to people who've maybe felt unwelcome in those spaces before. And for a while, I've been breaking down sports romances in a way that helps you understand the sport itself, and also how well those romances utilize the sport in order to build their characters and their romances in a way that wouldn't be as impactful outside of the world of those sports. And the idea for this series came from the fact that sports romances were 100% making new fans of sports out of people whom previously maybe didn't feel welcome or even interested in the sports themselves. And while I've covered a bunch of different types of romance books, like a bunch of different sports that were the focus of those books, nothing has made as big of an impact as Heated Rivalry has when this television show came out. And so if you're new and you want to be able to watch the context of this show episode by episode, be sure to go back and watch episodes 1 through 5, which are already out. And if you've been following along since the very beginning of this series, welcome back. I know we're finally here. We're finally doing the last episode, and I am very sad to be done with it. Now, this episode will have spoilers for episode 6, just as a heads up. And also, if you have watched episode 6, you know that there are some more impactful mental aspects of this show that I think are really well done, and I am going to talk about them a little bit as they personally affected me. So all of that being said, let's dive into episode 6 of Heated Rivalry, The Cottage. And let's talk about how well done the hockey is and how the hockey itself is a part of their romance in such a big way. One of the big hockey things in this episode comes right at the very beginning, and it's really the only aspect of this episode that we see relevant to the other hockey players or hockey in general and the league. And that is Scott Hunter accepting the MVP award for the year at the MLH Awards. Now, one thing you may not know if you're new to hockey is that the NHL has a lot of different awards and a lot of awards that are really specific. And like most sports, there are 2 different MVP awards. There is the MVP of the regular season as well as the MVP of the Stanley Cup Finals. This means that there's an MVP who's awarded for the entirety of the regular season out of the entire league, and then there's an additional MVP that's awarded for the Stanley Cup Finals. Now, the thing about this that's really important to understand for the context of Scott receiving this award is that the award he's receiving appears to be the MVP for the regular season. And what I think is really important to understand is that the voting for that award would have been done before Scott came out and before he won the cup. When it comes to the regular season awards, different awards are voted on by different groups, meaning that some awards are voted on by the players, other awards are voted on by the coaches and the staff, and the MVP award that Scott is accepting, along with other awards that are awarded in this season, are voted on by the Professional Hockey Writers Association. So what's really important to understand about this award for Scott is that it is not an award that was given to him by his peers or by the coaching staff or by the league itself. It would actually have been voted on by the Professional Hockey Writers Association, which is a North American association for the writers and journalists that cover the NHL. And again, that voting would have actually been based on Scott's regular season. So this season that we're seeing covered in a way where we're seeing how much people are saying like, oh, Scott is washed, and then he ultimately is able to kind of come back together and pull his team to the Stanley Cup Finals. And the timing of this voting and when things would have been announced is actually that the finalists would have been announced at the end of the regular season before the playoffs, and the winner would have been announced at the MLH Awards, which is where we see Scott accept it. Knowing all of that, it puts things really into context when we see Scott accept this award, but also it puts his mindset into context when we talk about him coming out. Heading into the playoffs in the first place, just in the first round before we even get all the way to the finals, Scott would have known that he was a finalist for MVP. He's obviously had a number of seasons we've watched where Scott has basically been falling apart at the seams. We know that episode 3, which is where we see a lot of this down spiral in his performance, takes place just a couple of months before the Olympics, and that this episode is 3 years after that experience. Episode 3 ends in 2014, and this episode takes place in 2017. So we know that Scott has had this level of heartbreak with Kip, but we also know that over the past 3 years, Scott has not only built himself back up to being a Stanley Cup champion, but that he has come back from 3 years ago where everyone was saying he was washed, he was too old, and that he would never hold the cup. We also know that the New York Admirals have not been able to win or make the finals in a very long time, and knowing that Scott was a finalist for MVP and of course that he actually wins the cup, we know that over the last 3 years from the last time that we saw him at the end of episode 3, that he has really rebuilt his life, his hockey team, and really his perception in terms of of his career. For Scott to be a finalist for MVP, he really was at a point where everyone, including critics, believed that he was one of the strongest players in the league. So for all of that to already be part of his mindset heading into the playoffs, he not only has the pressure of that to be able to maintain it and get all the way through the finals and win the cup, it also means that he understands that he has actually gotten himself to a point where everyone seems to respect him and believe in him, and at the very height of that makes the decision to make his relationship with Kip incredibly public. And I think all of the context there going into this award and also understanding it for the end of episode 5 is really strong when you listen to what Scott has to say in his speech. Having the context of knowing that Scott's MVP award was not voted on by his peers, but by the journalists who write about hockey and have been criticizing him for years, and that this vote was made before he came out or before he even won the cup, really puts into perspective that this is not the league accepting who Scott is or accepting his relationship with Kip, and it's certainly not them celebrating it. It's actually an award that was decided on by merit before he even stepped foot onto the ice for the playoffs. So when we listen to Scott's speech where he talks so much about hockey culture and what it was like to grow up in these locker rooms and to continue being a man in these locker rooms moving forward in his professional career, there's this interesting dichotomy that comes out of him accepting this award that he's earned, but also understanding that it is not an award of acceptance. It's also very clear that he's talking about the things in the league that need to change, and that they're deep-seated in a way that we're not only watching him and Kip deal with, but in a way that informs Shane and Ilya's relationship as well. And in this, I found it really relevant that Scott really doesn't talk about players or anyone else reaching out to him, but specifically talks about the fans. We again are not hearing him say that the league has been incredibly accepting or that everyone in this room has been very helpful. He doesn't talk about anyone reaching out and saying that they're proud of him or that they think that this will change the league or even that they're okay with it. What he talks about instead is the fear and the loneliness that he experienced, the power of loving someone being stronger than the fear that he's experienced his entire career and objectively his whole life, and the strong response that he received from fans saying how important it was to them. In this moment, we see this version of Scott that does feel really fully formed. When we meet Scott, we know that hockey is not only the only thing in his life, but also the only thing that keeps him connected to his parents who've passed away, and also the only family he feels that he's known for most of his life. In episode 3, hockey is what keeps him safe, but in this speech, we know that hockey is also this constant danger to him. In this speech, Scott really talks about the culture of hockey and about the locker room and about his teammates in a way that makes you understand that he believes that he's actually the danger in that locker room. He wants to fit in, and even though the comments being made where he talks about being the thing that people talked about in the locker room in a negative way really grates on him and pushes him into a deeper place of fear overall, also is something that he didn't want anyone to find out about. But there is this beauty in his speech and in the possibility of things changing, which we'll hear referenced at the dinner table with Ilya and Shane later. Scott and Kip's book is aptly titled Game Changer, and I think it's so clear in this speech as he talks through the culture of hockey and what was so different for him growing up and what made him so scared, but also becomes the face of a new possibility. As the most valuable player in the league, as voted on by his merit and his success, Scott takes a very public risk at the height of his career. He's not only the MVP, but the MLH Cup champion. I don't know that we ever have this cup named. It's not obviously the Stanley Cup, but that's what I'm calling it because we don't have a name. It's just like the MLH Cup. Anyway, the point is Scott is really at this height of his career, but he actually makes this massively risky choice because, as he very powerfully says, fear is a very powerful thing, but then I found the one thing that is more powerful. He doesn't say the words, but the answer is love. I found the performance from Francois in this scene so powerful, especially when you recognize the fact that he's standing in an empty room with piped in laughter and reactions, and that because of budget constraints, he doesn't even have Kip to look at. Kip is watching from home, and we see him watching in the bar with his friends. And from a production standpoint, there's something interesting in Francois making this speech as Scott, talking about loneliness and fear, and doing so in a completely empty room. So from a hockey point of view, I think one of the most important things to understand about this speech is that it is not a sign of acceptance from the league. It's not a sign of acceptance from his peers, from his teammates, from his coaches, and it's not even a sign of acceptance from the fans. What it is a very clear expectation of risk that Scott took, knowing that he was at the height of his career, that he could lose everything, and that people finally seemed to be respecting him after years of being bogged down by criticism, and choosing love over fear for the first time in his life. And that choice ultimately inspires what we see for the rest of the episode, which is Ilya and Shane in the cottage being honest with each other. But none of that happens if it's not for Scott Hunter and the speech that we see here. Which brings us to the moment that the episode really kicks off in earnest, which is Ilya's arrival in Ottawa. Now, this is something that we would expect these boys are trying to be very private about. No one would want these 2 weeks that they're spending together, which should be incredibly private, to be outed by someone just seeing them at the airport. There's really no reason as to why Ilya Rozanov, famed Boston player and Russian, should be seen in the Ottawa airport, which is why he should arrive in a very inconspicuous outfit. He should definitely not dress dressed like the Terminator in all black with his arms out, but more than that, because of course you could just write off those exposed arms like some other hot guy walking through the airport if it was a quick glance. And especially given the fact that he's wearing a hat and sunglasses, which should definitely help him conceal his identity, except that hat is literally a Boston Raiders hat. I'm not joking, this is something I didn't notice on my first watch, but it is something that has haunted me ever since my second watch. The side of the hat that Ilia is wearing backwards, like a beacon to anyone who's ever been attracted to frat bros, has the embroidery of the MLH logo on the side of it, which means that unless he decided to pick up a Montreal Metro's hat or an Ottawa Centaurs hat in the airport, that man is literally walking through the airport wearing a Boston Raiders hat on backwards. So just in case, as you were walking and saw him pass you front facing and you were like, is that Ilya Rozanov? No way. Oh wait. While he walks behind you, you're gonna see on the back of his hat that it's a Boston Raiders hat. And the thing about it is, I can't decide if this was a costuming thing where they just grabbed the hats that they had and they were like, oh, it's no big deal. No one's gonna notice. No one's gonna be a little bit of a crazy person like me. Or if it's an intentional rage bait, because if you do watch the rest of the episode, he does get rid of the hat. He arrives with the hat on and the sunglasses on before he gets in the car. He trips Shane about the car itself. And then later on, as we watch the car ride, that hat is gone. And I have to imagine that somewhere in those cuts, Shane saw the back of the hat and was like, what is wrong with you? But are we surprised? This is Ilya Rozanov, professional rage baiter who tried to get a man to admit that he had feelings for him by making him tuna melts and asking if he found women attractive. Which all leads me to believe that he intentionally put that Boston Raiders hat on backwards just to see if Shane would notice. Like, I have to imagine he was getting ready for the airport and he was like, what's the least conspicuous thing I can put on? Let me make sure my arms are out and completely exposed. Let me put these hot guy sweatpants on. Some sunglasses would help. And oh yeah, my Boston Raiders hat. Maybe if we wear sunglasses and the logo of our literal teams, no one will notice that we're not where we're supposed to be and that we're hanging out. Though of course we know that nobody noticed them in the airport and that they do get away with this. And so then we jump into the conversation in the car. One of the things I love about this conversation is that we see so much of their dynamic, and we also see it start to shift now that Shane really does understand that Ilia does have feelings for him and that Shane reciprocates them. Ilia on one side is still utilizing his coping mechanisms, his defense mechanisms by making everything into a little joke, and Shane really does take control in this episode and push in a way that we've seen him do since the All-Star weekend. There's this one moment in the car conversation where they're both so nervous and tense, and Shane says he thinks that Ilia will like the cottage because it's quiet and relaxing, and Ilia immediately makes a joke and says, is that what we're going to do? Relax. There's this innuendo, there's this thing that they're comfortable with where nothing is really getting under the surface, but Shane's the one to really push it and be honest and say, I hope so. I'd like to relax with you for once. There's a really specific reference to the way that we've seen their relationship unfold. So far, everything that they've been able to do and explore with each other has always been in these stolen moments at games, at all-star games, home games, away games, in all of these spaces and hotel rooms and things that are not really personal to them in any way, shape, or form. There's always been this fear of being found out, but also the fact that they've never been on a neutral site. Every moment in their relationship so far has either been over text or when it's in person in a space where one of them has home court advantage, so to speak. This is the first time where they get to be somewhere personal where the season is completely off. There's no level of competition and they have to really just enjoy each other's company. And this idea of relaxation really highlights how much they're not relaxed throughout their entire careers or their relationship. Not only are we seeing this level of comfort between the two of them, but we're also reminded of the amount of fear that Scott talked about before this. Every moment that they have had has felt stolen. And this is the first time, and we feel that in the pacing of the episode, where they can take their time and really listen to each other and have conversations, not just have a couple of stolen hours before a game or after one. And I love how much we watch Ilia physically unwind in this car ride after this moment. We talk a lot about how Ilia is the one that has to push Shane or find ways to communicate, but I think also Shane does such a good job of pushing the buttons that need to be pushed for Ilia. It would be so easy to just let him shut down and make everything a joke and keep everything so surface level, even though Ilia is someone that understands and feels things in such a deep way. Shane is this kind of unmoving force once he's decided that this is what he wants. And it's not in a way that he's pushing Ilia too far, too fast, but in a way that he's telling him it's safe to kind of feel things here, which is something that Ilia, as we learn more in this episode, has really never experienced. Shane's life up until this point has all been about control, and Ilia has been this thing he hasn't been able to control, and also a place where he's able to let go of control. And Ilia's life has always been about hiding his emotions, his feelings, his identity. And Shane is this person who, for the first time, Ilia can really be himself around. But there are a lot of moments where he has to be reminded that it is a safe place. And I think you watch them both physically kind of relax in this conversation. And the Boston Raiders hat is gone, so, you know, for a moment in this car ride, hockey is not the focus of anything. And instead, it's something that they can finally escape. Now, when we get to the cottage itself, we're right back into some references that I think are really funny and also really show show how well done the hockey is here. Shane carries Ilya's bag from the car into the cottage, and Ilya complains, and Shane points out the fact that he played through his bruised ribs. Now, one of the things that is so funny about this is if you look at the current playoffs, we know that actually players are constantly playing through injury in a way that seems insane when it comes to hockey. Hilary Knight played through a torn MCL for the Olympics, she revealed after they won the gold. A number of players have revealed that they had broken hands, broken feet in this year's playoffs. We know that hockey players, both men and women, play through extreme injury regardless as they're chasing a championship. And there's something very married couple about Shane kind of making fun of him, but then also being like, yeah, whatever, I would have done it too. Hockey players 100% play through injury in a way that is very probably dangerous. But I think this is a high-level athlete thing. We saw Lindsey Vonn do this with the Olympics as well. Playing through injury is something that would be a part of their life. And I will say that throughout this series, the only thing that we don't see that we probably would see in real life is that Shane and Ilia would consistently be battered and bruised every time that they're hooking up. There would be bruises down everyone's side. There would be like this tenderness in general, and there would be injury that they also are fighting through to be together after the hockey game itself. And I think that's something that's highlighted here, especially because the second that they go through the door, not only was Shane complaining about him playing through bruised ribs, he tosses his entire body weight right on top of him so that they can smooch on the couch. It's like injury is sort of just like a hazard of being alive for these guys, and it doesn't ever really get resolved. So as Shane gives Ilia the tour of his cottage, one of the other things that we get a reminder of is how much the two of them are able to learn about each other when they're apart just because of how intense hockey is. Ilia says that Shane's real estate fetish really paid off in reference to the cottage itself, and Shane says that he didn't buy this place but that he had it built, which Ilia says, oh, I know. And one of the things that really stands out here is this reference to how much of each other they've learned through the eyes of other people. Ilia and Shane have been in this situationship, so to speak, for about 8 years, which we hear Ilia reference when they're playing around as though they are like bellhop and customer, where he says, I think I know how the staff likes to be treated after 8 years. But the thing to really put into perspective here is how little physical time they were actually spending with each other all of these years. Shane and Ilia would have played against each other 3 or 4 times each season, which gives them about 3 to 4 times in the regular season to meet up, plus if they ever played against each other during the playoffs, which they would have, and then you have the All-Star game and the MLH Awards. And those are literally the only times each year that they're getting to see each other. So if you really put into perspective these stolen moments that they've been able to have with each other over the last 8 years, it's probably less than 10 hours a year that they've actually spent in each other's presence, unless you count the actual time on the ice as well. And even then, it's maybe 20, 30. It is so little time that they're actually spending physically with each other that they really haven't even had time to talk in an extreme way or really share anything with each other. But because of how famous they are and how big they would be in each other's circles, they're constantly getting these little snippets of each other from other people. Whether that's press that Shane or Ilia are doing, which we've seen both of them watching press conferences of the other, whether that is this little documentary that Shane did on his cottage, which we of course watched Ilia watch when he was kind of waiting for Svetlana to get ready, or a number of people talking about them, as we've seen a number of different people in Shane and Ilia's lives both talk about the other. All of their perspectives of each other, their versions of each other that they've fallen in love with. All of that is built up not only from the couple of hours they've been able to steal with each other over the last 8 years, but also from the perspective of other people, through other people's lenses. And for Ilia to be standing physically in this cottage with Shane, to be getting a tour from Shane, to be told about his well, to be told that he's put Cokes in the fridge just for Ilia, all of this would be almost like walking into a dream for Ilia or a documentary of some sort. There's this version of Shane that Ilia knows, and there's a version of Shane that Ilia has seen Shane portray to everyone else. And both of those are very inherently different than what Ilia knows to be true. So for the first time, Ilia is standing in a space that Shane has shared with the world but has never shared with him. And there's newfound trust in that, because not only is Shane sharing something with him, it's also something that he's making space for Ilia in. And something that, to some degree, Shane doesn't realize Ilia has been tracking. When Ilia says, I know, there's surprise on Shane's face, and so much of that is because he doesn't know how interested Ilia really is in him. Ilia is so nonchalant, he makes everything a joke. And for a split second, even though Ilia's delivery of the I know is quite cocky, there's also a realization that he's admitting that he's been watching Shane all these years, that he has been consuming every little thing that he possibly could about Shane. At first, when they were teenagers, probably from a level of competition and interest, then as they met in person and understanding that they shared the same secret, and as they started to build their relationship together, almost a level of constant obsession looking for any crumb that he could get about Shane's personality. So much of that is informed by the fact that they are both so famous. And not only that they're both so famous, but that they're famous in the same way. And so I love how this episode works, because at the very beginning, we have Ilia walking through in his very kind of hot guy outfit, wearing the logo of his literal rival team. And then slowly but surely, we watch all of that kind of get broken down as we start to see a private version of the two of them. And that for the first time, they have a chance to really get to know each other outside of what they've learned from the media. Even though it feels very small, this admission that Ilia knows something about Shane that Shane hasn't personally told him is a reminder that their entire lives and their entire relationship is completely under scrutiny. Everything that they do, including buying a piece of property or building a cottage in the middle of nowhere, is public record. And it is this constant reminder that they have this danger behind them, that if anyone were to find out, that would be public record too. People want to know everything about these two guys. They are the best hockey players in the league in a generation, and that they are famous to the point that Shane could have an entire documentary made about some random cottage that he built and a well that he dug for himself. And so as we start this episode, as we go into this kind of privacy bubble that they get for the very first time, it's a reminder that just outside the door there is danger in the public level of their lives. So then we get into this kind of rapid fire getting to know each other and being honest. There are a couple of really fun facts that we get that are also referencing some big moments that are hockey related, and one of which is this reference to McGill. One of the funniest lines in this episode is Ilia reacting to Shane telling him his dad played for McGill. But one of the reasons that it's so funny is that McGill is widely recognized as the birth of organized hockey. Now, the thing that's important to understand is that the men of McGill did not invent hockey as a sport. Ice hockey goes all the way back to indigenous peoples playing it in Nova Scotia, and the game evolved into what we know it as today. But McGill is credited as the first place that there was an organized hockey game. This took place in 1875, and it's the first time that we really see people talk about having a rule book and different ways that the game itself was scored and figured out. So Shane's dad playing for McGill actually references like the history of organized hockey in the first place. And there's something really funny about Shane understanding the impact of that and Ilia literally not even knowing the school exists. Obviously, there's the fact that Shane is Canadian, would know this more so than Ilia, who's Russian, but also it's a reminder of this dichotomy of their relationship with hockey. Shane really genuinely loves hockey. This is something that is in his DNA and that he would do no matter who he was. But Ilia kind of finds hockey as something that he's not only very good at, but also something that allows him to escape his family. And there's something really wonderful in the character space of it, of this reference being there, of knowing this history of hockey, of knowing how intentional it is, of seeing it not only in Shane's blood, but also in his father's. And for Ilia to not even know that McGill is a thing, like he doesn't know it's a school, if it's a town, what it is. Meanwhile, McGill has this level of history when it comes to hockey of not only having the first organized game, but then 2 years later, starting the first actual codified rules of hockey, and of course, becoming the first official hockey club ever. In this conversation about Shane's parents, we also get this reference of Shane saying that he thinks he would have told his parents that he's gay if it weren't for Ilia. And there's a long moment that it takes Ilia to understand what he's saying. But it's actually really telling that Ilia doesn't understand that these two things are so inherently connected. Ilia says that Shane could tell his parents without telling them that Ilia is the person that he's been with. And Shane doesn't really seem to understand that or agree with that in a way that I think is really strong. Shane's understanding of who he is, his sexuality, and who he loves really comes down to Ilia as one person. And there's a level of watching his understanding of himself and his eventual self-acceptance that only comes together because of how much he loves Ilia, because of how much he's learned about himself through Ilia, and also once he has a chance to compare it to something else like Rose, how much he understands that this is a really serious thing. So for Shane, telling his parents that he's gay would come hand in hand with telling them about Ilia, because there's no other way for him to understand who he is if Ilia is not there. And what Ilia does understand is the reason why Shane couldn't tell them about Ilia. We'll get into this more deeply as we get into the episode, and we've also talked about this in the previous episode breakdowns, but the idea of Shane being gay is one thing. The idea of Shane and Ilia being together is a completely different thing. Shane's mother in particular is so locked in on the world of hockey and of the loyalty of it and the understanding of her rivalry. We have watched his parents consistently make references to Ilia and their rivalry. There is literally a moment in an earlier episode where Shane's mom says, "Screw Rozanov right up the butt." The idea of Shane telling his parents about Ilia is so incomprehensible, and so much of that is because of the hockey. And we understand this war for Shane as he's talking about this with Ilia, in that he believes his parents would be okay with him being gay. That's not really where his fear is. His fear is whether or not they would accept the person that he loves. Not because of their gender, but because of who they are in relation to his hockey career. And you have to understand that over the last 8, 9, 10 years, they would have been pitted against each other, and in their household, there would have been a lot of conversation about it. We've seen both Shane and Ilia's parents reference the other one. Ilia is told by his father that he will not lose to Shane. Shane's mother multiple times talks about how much they hate Rozanov. And in the episode before, there's even a conversation where Shane's dad is confused that they don't hate Rozanov anymore just because he came and visited in the hospital. There's so much weight to the idea of Shane's sexuality and their secret overall, but there's even more weight to it when you think about the fact that Shane really can't talk about this if he doesn't talk about Ilia also. And I do think we watch Ilia understand the impact of that. that. Because when he suggests that Shane just tell them his secret without telling them about Ilia, Shane really shuts down at that. And we see Ilia kind of pull away. He takes his hand off of Shane's thigh and he tries to process that. And I think for the first time, we see Ilia start to understand how much Shane really does care for him. And Ilia, of course, has this personality type that you have to beat it into him. You have to constantly tell him, I like you, I want to be around you, I want this to work out. And Shane does so both directly in this episode, but also indirectly in conversations like this, where it doesn't even cross his mind that he would tell his parents that he's gay without telling them that he's also in love with Ilia. And of course, all of this is done in this conversational way that is so Shane and Ilia of not communicating. Of Shane saying, sometimes I think I would have told them if it weren't for, and sort of gesturing between the two of them. And Ilia taking a long time to say, oh, is this my fault? It's still combative, even though it's probably one of the most honest and vulnerable conversations they've ever had. And it's probably one of the most honest and sweet things Shane has ever said to him. And later in this episode, we see Ilia kind of return that same vulnerability. And that's when he tells Shane about his mom. Now for me, Ilia's journey with the grief of his mother was really personal because I have lost someone in the same way. And outside of hockey and the context of this, I did want to talk about this moment because I think it's done in a way that was really one of my favorite ways and most seen ways that I've seen anyone do it. I feel very similarly about The Long Game and how well it's written, in that this was one of the first pieces of media I've seen since experiencing this where I thought that it was done in a way that felt very honest, very true, and not done for shock value. A lot of times this type of backstory, this tragic backstory, is used in a way that is meant just to kind of add color or some sort of tragedy that is a shock value moment. And at no point, for me at least, I think everybody has different feelings, but at no point for me did this feel inauthentic. This felt really true in a way that someone is kind of trying to process this extreme loss at such a young age as well, and also trying to find a way to share it without feeling like a burden, and finding a way to talk about it in a way that honored the person that he'd lost. Ilia says that he doesn't want Shane to think that his mother was weak because she wasn't. And Shane does say that he doesn't find her weak, but he kind of has already lost Ilia at this moment. I think Ilia seems to have really figured out what he wanted to say and is trying to get it out there. And the things that he tells Shane about his mother is that she was beautiful and that she was funny and that she was so sad. And there's this expectation that when you lose someone in this way, that it is a weak thing. It's also a word that probably was used in Ilia's household about his mother in a way that he had to constantly fight against and make his own opinion about and find a way to really make peace with it himself. There's also a clear understanding that Ilia was much more close to his mother than he was to his father and even to his brother, and that I'm sure there were moments where he was told he was just like his mother or that he took after his mother. And there's a lot to put into perspective for someone and the way that they're being built up, knowing that they're growing up in a household that's very violent and masculine and unforgiving, and knowing that you are seen as the more sensitive and weak person, and that weakness is tied to someone that you loved and that you lost. We get so much of who Ilia is and why he becomes the person that he is in this conversation. It's only a couple of sentences really, but they are really important and beautiful sentences. And it also shows the fact that he's willing to open up to a degree to Shane that he wasn't previously. Ilia does talk about his mom to Shane before when they're in the hotel room at the All-Star weekend. He says that his dad is sick, he says that his brother is terrible, and he says that his mom is dead. And when Shane says that he's sorry about that, Ilia says that he was young and it was a long time ago. Now we get the truth of it. He was 12 and he found her. And for me, this moment also really colors Ilia's relationship with hockey as a whole and the person that he's become. We know that Ilia on the ice is known for getting into fights, for being aggressive, for being intense. We also know that he's known for being cocky and loud. And all of those sort of references and character traits are pretty familiar in terms of talking about his family when we talk about his brother and his father, not about his mother. And we also know from the age range and the way that hockey works, that when Ilia's mother's passed, he would have already kind of been locked into hockey. Most likely his mother would have been the one taking him to the rink and kind of experiencing it with him, but that at 12 years old, he would have already shown a lot of promise in that sport. It implies that as he's going through this incredible loss in his life, we also now know that in the first episode when we meet him for the very first time through Shane's eyes, it's only been about 5 years since he lost his mom. And we know that he's become this incredible prospect that everyone knows worldwide and that we expect to see him go into the professional league as a direct competitor to Shane. But with Shane, we know that his experience with hockey comes from a deep love of it and from his parents pushing him and supporting him. Shane's mother arguably is probably too close to him when it comes to being supportive. For Ilia, we know now that this relationship with hockey, this experience that he has and this intensity, that comes from 5 years of being incredibly lost, incredibly alone, and incredibly sad. And we do get this sort of two sides of two completely different coins as we get to know Shane and Ilia's relationship with their parents and their upbringing and how that affected hockey in this space. Because in just a second, with his head laid on Shane's lap in a moment where he finally feels safe enough to say something, we find out that Ilia's career and the person that he is has been built on this incredible level of grief, and that most likely he never even had a moment to really process it. At 12, he loses his mother. At 17, he is already such such a level of international prospect that he's expected to go into the draft first overall. At 18, he goes first overall, and for the next 8 years, he plays his part in the league. He is aggressive on the ice, he gets into fights, he plays into this rivalry against Shane Hollander, and he does the only thing that he knows how to do, which is make people laugh and entertain them. And he does all of those things with the knowledge that if he ever has to go back home, the ghost of his mother and the expectations of the people who never really truly understood her, and by extension never really truly understood Ilia, are what's waiting for him if he can't be in the MLH and stay in the US, which is why they need a real plan. After this conversation, we also see that Ilia really settles into this idea of being accepted and open with Shane. And I think one of the quietest moments that we see this is when they wake up and Ilia just says, "Good morning, I like you." There are no qualifiers after that. He just genuinely says, "I like you." And that is, again, another moment that references back to something different that he did in the previous episodes. In the Tuna Melts episode, when he is actually trying to get Shane to maybe admit that he has feelings for him, Ilia says, "I like you, not as person, though." And instead, we just get a genuine, "I like you. This is how I feel. I mean it." And we get a moment of comedic relief, shall we say, which I will speak about briefly, but not in depth. Shane and Ilia are in their free time playing the MLH hockey game, which is featuring themselves as players. There's something very hilarious, but also very genuine in that the moment that they don't have to be fighting each other on the ice, they pick up a video game version and fight each other on the ice. There are so many little moments of references to their competitiveness, to their dynamic, and the idea of them still fighting with each other even when they don't have to. I also think that we all know a couple like this where they just can't seem to stop being competitive or ridiculous, but they're also so obsessed with each other that you're almost like, okay, go away, get a room. And again, the video game is a reminder of their outside life that is keeping them from having this private moment be public. Ilia says that he's going to play with the Metros, and we get a reference to them being better than the Yankees. And I think it's always relevant to remember how big of a deal playing for Montreal and bringing a cup home to Montreal would have been. If we just put it into context of like the real life Montreal team, which are the Montreal Canadiens, also known as the Habs, for one of the games for the playoffs that are happening right now, their entire stadium was full of people just watching the game on the Jumbotron that literally looked like an actual game was happening inside the stadium. And of course, as these playoffs have gone over, we've continued to see fans post videos of them beating up effigies of other players. There is this intensity in Montreal of this game and this team, and also a reminder that Shane and Ilia have brought their teams back to sort of glory. They both play for original six teams in Montreal and Boston. And if we put it into context of the real NHL, Montreal has not won a Stanley Cup since 1993 when they beat the LA Kings. And in that series, when they brought home the cup, that was the last time that any Canadian team brought home a Stanley Cup. Now, with Shane, they've won multiple ones, but the team still has this level of legacy that even Ilia can joke about. And of course, Ilia is the one on the cover of the game, which if you're not familiar with video games in terms of sports video games, there's a different player on the front of every game. This is not just for the NHL, but for the NBA, for the NFL, and it's a kind of an honor to be on the front of the cover. So again, there's something fun in the fact that the version of the game Shane has Ilia on the cover in his cottage, and the sort of playfulness that the video game brings out in each other, and the fact that they can't really seem to make it very long without going into competition mode. And while that competition may have been thwarted by a phone call, Ilya's not really willing to let that competitive edge go, is he? I do think that there's something so fun in how competitive they are in every aspect of their relationship, and how even in one of the sweetest episodes of them really expressing their feelings for each other, they can't go a couple of hours without kind of finding a way to make a new competition, whether that competition is appropriate for all ears or not. But we do, of course, get the new level of their dynamic immediately after the phone call, where they're giggling around and Shane says, "Why was that so fun?" And Ilia says, "Because you like to be bad." And Shane really takes this moment to hold Ilia, to have eye contact, to say that that's not what this is. Maybe it started out that way, but it isn't that way anymore. Which, even though Ilia makes a joke to diffuse the seriousness of that moment almost immediately, he does start to make plans himself after this. And this is where we get into a lot of the hockey of this episode. I've gotten a lot of questions about whether or not all of this would be real or realistic, or how legitimate their plan would be, and I do think it's really fun to break down not only the actual plan itself, but the way that they come to it and the different ideas that they have before. Ilia is the one to really start making a plan, or at least to suggest that they might make one. They're kicking a soccer ball around outside, and he brings up the fact that he's going to be a free agent next season. Now, this is something that has been a little bit confusing for people who've never watched hockey before, or if this is your first experience with sports. And there is a difference between free agency and being traded. When you are a free agent, it means that you're at the end of your contract and you have the ability to sign with whatever team you would like to. So when Ilia says that he's going to be a free agent next season, it doesn't mean that he would be traded from one team or another. And being traded is when a team that you're on makes the decision to send you to another team in exchange for another player or for draft picks or for some combination thereof. Players may also end up leaving their team when they're waived, which means that the team just drops them from their contract. But what Ilya is talking about here is being a free agent, which means that he would be the one in control of the decisions he's making. He suggests that he wouldn't re-sign with Boston, but would sign with a Canadian team, obviously not Montreal, and it would give him an opportunity to not have a Russian passport. Now, there are a couple of layers to this, one of which being the fact that the path to Canadian citizenship is a little bit different than the path to American citizenship, and it also tells us that Ilya's contract is up before Shane's is. The way contracts work in the NHL is that you have what's called an entry-level contract when you first sign, and based on the age you are when you sign that contract is the length of the contract itself. It's a little complicated in the NHL, but essentially because both of them were first-round draft picks and 18 years old, they most likely would have been on 3-year entry-level contracts at the very beginning of their careers. At the end of those 3-year contracts, they would have been able to make a decision of where they wanted to go, and they ultimately both have stayed as they've continued to renew their contracts with Boston and Montreal. For Ilya to be a free agent at the end of next season, it means that he has 1 year left on his contract, and then he can ultimately decide what team he wants to play for, and that's something that would be starting to be negotiated soon. It's also important to understand that both of these players probably have things like no trade clauses in their contracts, and also don't have to really worry about being traded away given how much of an importance they are to both of their teams. They're both captains, they're both extremely good players, and they both have revived these franchises and are the face of their franchises, which is also a very big deal when you talk about someone voluntarily leaving that city. But it's pretty significant that Ilya is the one to start this conversation. He puts out the facts, which are he doesn't want his Russian passport anymore, and he wants to potentially move to Canada, and that he has the ability to move teams, and that he's willing to do so. These are all kind of big facts for Shane to start processing, and especially to start building a plan around. Of course, Ilya comes up with a secondary option, which is that he could marry Svetlana, and Shane could potentially set the entire house on fire with both of them in it. It would be about the same kind of reaction. That version would obviously keep Ilya in Boston and keep their schedule the way that it is, and that he would be in a sham friendship marriage with Svetlana, but also, as much as it's a little bit of rage bait, it's also Ilya giving Shane an option that doesn't require him to do anything or change anything about his life. At this point, Ilya would be safe with American citizenship, they could continue their relationship in the way that they've been doing it now, and they would have a public kind of shield in Svetlana as well. But obviously Shane is not thrilled by the idea, which is how we get into the official plan. Shane sits up in the middle of the night while Ilya sleeps and thinks about this like a spree killer would, then wakes Ilya up and comes through with this new plan that is actually pretty legitimate. So let's break down this plan and whether or not it would actually be legitimate, and also what the implications would be. Shane's first suggestion is that Ilya moves to Ottawa in free agency. Either way, no matter what the plan is, the understanding is that the next season that they're going to do will be exactly the same way it's been with this Boston and Montreal meetup. They have basically a full year, a little bit more than that, before they can really change anything about their situation and before Ilya can move teams. So this next year, Shane and Ilya are going to be separated, Montreal and Boston, and it's going to be pretty much the same except for the fact that they've actually admitted their feelings for each other. But then we go into free agency, which is where Ilya can now make some moves. Shane suggests that Ilya will sign with Ottawa. Now, Ilya brings up a very legitimate point, which is that Ottawa is still in the same division as Montreal and Boston. Not only does this keep them in the same division for rivalry aspects of the narrative, it also means that Ilya would be leaving Boston to go to another team in their division, which is a pretty rough narrative for himself as a player and for a Boston person. The Boston fan base would be incredibly upset that he's not only leaving, but leaving to play for another team in their division, which would be considered a rival. Obviously not as intense of a rivalry as Montreal, but a rivalry nonetheless. But Shane points out a couple of facts that are pretty relevant. One, they're only a couple of hours apart for the entirety of the season, which is true, and that the rivalry itself is not as intense. Boston and Montreal are incredible rivals, but Ottawa and Montreal not as much. The one kind of glaring flaw in this perspective from Shane is that while the rivalry between Boston and Montreal goes very, very deep and goes all the way back to the beginning of the league, and these two cities and these two teams have always been strong rivals, that rivalry over the last almost decade has been highlighted and intensified by Shane and Ilya specifically. So Ilya just moving to another team that isn't necessarily as heated of a rivalry would still be a big narrative of them being rivals, especially them still being in the same division. However, he is right in the fact that it's not as deep-seated, as not as intense. But this rivalry narrative wouldn't go away immediately just from him moving to another team in the division. But there are some strong business reasons that Shane points out that are very legitimate. One, Ottawa is in need of a star center. Center is the position that both Ilya and Shane play, and obviously Ilya is one of the hotter ones in the league. Now, one of the things that is relevant here is that it does point out that Ottawa is not necessarily a great team at the moment. There's a reminder that Ottawa is not a very strong team, and it also reminds us that we've never really seen Ottawa talked about up until now. We've seen 3 different teams in this Eastern Conference not actually play against Ottawa or talk about them as a rival or as a threat. So we get the reminder that Ottawa is kind of in a phase where they do need a star, but also that they're not a strong team that Ilya would be moving to. He's leaving Boston, where he's winning cups, where he's being competitive, where he's intense, where he's just gone further in the playoffs than Shane has, to go to a team that really is not competitive at all and is in desperate need of a better player. And we know that in addition because Shane points out the fact that they definitely have enough room in the salary cap to afford Ilya. Now, every team in the NHL has a cap of how much they're allowed to spend in player salaries. Salary caps were invented in sports to hopefully keep you from just having very rich teams have all of the stars on one team and to spread that talent out throughout the league. In theory, you shouldn't see Shane and Ilya on the same team because of how high their salary is, the fact that they play the same position, and the fact that the salary cap would be a problem. Shane is pointing out that Ottawa doesn't really have anyone on the team, which means they can certainly afford Ilya. And this is a very legitimate point and a very legitimate aspect of what you would see these players kind of trying to figure out. Ilya making a move from Boston, where he's been the center of the team and certainly the center of that salary cap as well, would need to move to a team that could afford him, meaning that they have the space in their salary cap to afford him, which also means that they have a level of lack of talent on their ice at the moment. And the next part of Shane's master plan is the idea that hopefully they can move on from the rivalry and allow these younger players coming in to start the next one. And this part of the plan I do think is a little bit wishful thinking. When we look at a comparative rivalry in the NHL, like between Sidney Crosby and Alexander Ovechkin, those guys have been playing for 21 seasons against each other. And the fact that they were playing their 100th game against each other was still one of the biggest talked about moments in this season of the NHL. Ilya and Shane getting rid of their intense rivalry while they're still at the height of their careers, winning cups and making a big deal out of themselves, just by moving Ilya to a worse team in the same division and hoping that younger people start their own rivalries is definitely wishful thinking. I think that there would have to be an act of God to make people stop talking about Shane and Ilya being rivals. There is something very funny about Shane saying that they're not wrestlers, which I do think is actually pretty relevant in the way that their rivalry would have been marketed and the way that we've seen rivalries in the NHL marketed before. We do get these hilarious graphics of these players facing off against each other, and also this idea of like these pay-per-view matches almost that is very similar to the way that narratives work in wrestling. Sports at their core are all about entertainment, and it is all about a narrative and a show, because otherwise it's just random guys hitting pucks around. And unless Shane and Ilya actually force the league to stop this narrative, and even this little plan that they have is not necessarily going to do that. It would have to be something very intense, which of course we have a whole another season of this show to get to. Their rivalry makes money. It puts butts in seats. It puts eyes on television. And as much as they can try to force this narrative, it's not necessarily going to be a quick fix. However, the idea of them starting a charity together and having these kind of joint press conferences and showing a friendship that starts to build, starting just with close proximity and this new kind of move, does give us the option of them at least being perceived as slightly kind of friends. So Shane's plan, as laid out, is that Ilya will go to Ottawa in free agency, and then as they're 2 hours apart, they'll start to kind of be seen publicly together and start a charity. That charity, as we ultimately find out, will benefit mental health organizations in honor of Ilya's mother, and that charity will be a hockey school where they'll teach young kids how to play hockey, and they will donate the money to mental health charities. Now, this is a pretty common concept for NHL charities. NHL players do often host kids camps in the summer, and that money does get donated to charity. A number of really big players have those types of foundations, and this would be seen as pretty legitimate. However, one thing that definitely would happen is the conversation would be this surprise and awe in the idea that Shane and Ilya are doing it together. And so Shane is right in that fact that it would kind of have to force the narrative to change, because all of them would be talking about this idea that these two rivals who have hated each other for so long have now come together to benefit the good of mental health organizations and children. It's actually a pretty good idea for a forced narrative that you would have to have. On paper, this would allow them to be physically close to each other most of the time. However, in this conversation of them being 2 hours apart for the entire season, we do also forget that they'll have opposing travel schedules. But in theory, on paper, it solves a lot of problems. And this is also where we finally get the I love yous. Because Shane and Ilya both show the two things that I think allow them to understand how much they love each other. Shane shows that he's willing to put together a decade-long plan that involves them kind of being together as much as possible in secret, protects their careers, gives Ilya as much of himself as possible, gives Ilya safety, and also ultimately ends in them retiring and being together forever. And Ilya shows that he's willing to do what he does best, which is sacrifice his own happiness for what he believes is a perfect relationship with Shane. Ilya is willing to give up Boston, he's willing to move to Ottawa, he's willing to build a team from the very beginning. And all of those things are possible because, like we've talked about and like we've heard kind of the actors and the writers talk about, hockey is not the most important thing in the world to Ilya. Hockey Hockey is an escape, and this is a possible new escape that involves him being loved and having a new family. And there's something very beautiful about their I love yous coming from this deep, deep plan that Shane and Ilia have kind of been skirting around over the last couple of scenes. And then all of that nice, happy plan to just be in love secretly and love each other forever is shattered when Shane's dad forgets his phone charger. And once again, we're reminded that Ilia packed mostly Boston Raiders gear. I think he's wearing Shane's clothes for 90% of the episode, given the fact that he packed the equivalent of a briefcase for this 2-week trip, and that the only outfit he has to put on to meet Shane's parents is a Boston Raiders t-shirt, which 100% confirms to me that the hat in the beginning of the episode, Boston Raiders hat. The man packed his uniform and nothing else for an I love you 2-week vacation in the middle of nowhere. And I love that for him. I love him so much. But it also does kind of point out these little pressure points that Ilia understands on how to help Shane through kind of chaos. Shane is at a level of panic that he's probably never experienced before, and Ilia does something silly. He puts on a t-shirt that he knows will start a fight with Shane so that Shane has something else to focus on. It does, however, result in the fact that Yuna, who has no idea what's going on, sees through her big window her child walking up who's supposed to be on a silent retreat with Ilya Rozanov right behind him in tow, which also, if she wasn't sure if it was Ilya Rozanov, he's literally wearing a Boston Raiders t-shirt. And as silly as all of this feels, the rest of this episode between Shane, Ilia, and Shane's parents is exactly what Shane has been worried about the entire season. And it's a perfect version of exactly what all of the public reaction would be if they were to find out about Shane and Ilya's relationship. One of the first things that Yuna says when Shane reveals that Ilia and him are together is, "But you hate him." And Shane has to say, "I get that, but no, I actually love him." This is the exact shock that anyone would have when we're talking about these two guys being together. And as they go through their conversation, where Ilia and Shane reveal that they've been together since before rookie season, we're also revealing all of the same questions that would be asked by the public. The same questions that have caused this level of fear in Shane and Ilia in ever being caught. How long has this been going on? Did you ever let him win on the ice? Do your teammates know there were no nice men in Montreal? And even the speculation that Shane's dad has of them maybe having gotten together at the All-Star game because of how much chemistry they had. There are so many little moments in this quiet conversation, in this family dinner moment, of what the public would look like when they find out. Speculation of how long they've been together, of how many times they've let each other win, of how many conversations they've had off the ice that have affected things on the ice. And the worst part about this for Shane is that it is exactly what he's been afraid of. All of these questions, all of these conversations, this entire reaction, this is what Shane has been afraid of. Shane's mother especially, but Shane's parents both, are willing to accept his sexuality very quickly. They even say that they thought that this might be the possibility. But nobody ever would have suspected that Ilia was the person he was in love with. All of their questions that they ask were immediately about hockey, the careers that they've had, and what they may have changed for each other because of their relationship. And that's really where it all comes down to. That the hardest part about this conversation is the fact that all of the things that they've both been afraid of are completely legitimate. All of the reactions they were expecting happen right here with the two people that Shane loves most in the world. And if you take these questions and these moments between the four of them, it would be 1,000 times amplified by the fans and by the people in the league, their teammates, and everyone else involved. Even Scott Hunter would be surprised that the two of them were together and that there was a level of competition that we could never understand. These two guys have been together since before they were even in the league. So how can anyone process the fact that they were able to keep their rivalry and their competition on ice separate from the feelings that they had for each other? Plus, we even see his parents look at the idea of who Ilia has shown himself to be in the public. They talk about how many women he's been with, and that would be a huge conversation. If they've been together all of this time, then why has Ilia been with so many women so publicly? If they've been together all of this time, why did Shane date a movie star? The level of scrutiny that we see in this dinner conversation of just two parents trying to understand things would be 1,000% amplified when we get it into the public of people that don't know them personally. And of course, even the people who do know them personally that they've both been hiding this from. This scene between the four of them, while it ultimately becomes very heartwarming, is also a literal nightmare. From a hockey standpoint, it's done so well because we have all of these little conversations. Did you ever let him win on the ice? Did you ever let dad win at cards? And even Yuna saying, you have no loyalty to Boston, and Shane trying to point out, like, you have loyalty to me. That's the whole point here. Hockey can't even be separated from their relationship when it comes to their families. And I think everything about this episode, but especially this portion of it, is so well done because we've had this moment where we've gotten to see them completely in private, but the episode is completely sandwiched with two different versions of the league and how they would feel about it, and the world around them and how they would react. We start this episode out with Scott Hunter talking about the culture of the league and why it kept him for so long from being who he was. And we have him being himself very publicly in a way that would not be well received. Then we go into this quiet moment between Shane and Ilia as they slowly break down their barriers between each other and are able to be private with each other. And they come up with this new plan that in theory should work. But as soon as they're outed, that whole plan plan kind of falls apart because we put them under the microscope of all of the questions everyone would have about the last 8 years that they've spent falling in love, but publicly have spent as rivals and competitors as two of the best teams and players in the league. And so while this episode and this season does end on a very happy and high-level moment, where it does seem like they have a private level of success together, it's also a really big warning sign for everything that is to come as they put their plan into action, and as they try to take the risk of being together forever. And that sadly brings us to the end of Heated Rivalry Season 1. I have loved going through these, and I've loved how much this show has personally meant to me and how much it's meant to kind of the world around us. Since we started this series, Heated Rivalry has won a Peabody Award, which I think was very well deserved. We've seen the entire cast and crew really launched into the stratosphere, and we know that this show is coming back in a strong way. For me, I'm personally very excited to see how they tackle the long game and the ideas of mental health in this league and in sports in general. It's been a really big conversation around the league right now, especially given the fact that we've had multiple players kind of come out about mental health issues and the way that it hasn't been very well received, and with the captain of the Tampa Bay Lightning coming out and saying that he stepped away from the team in order to deal with his mental health, which was a priority, and for the team to be supporting him in doing that. So many of the things that are touched on in this show about hockey are a really big deal and really big problems that we're actively trying to fix in athletics and in sports in general. But also, I think that's part of why this show has done so well and why it's meant so much to so many people. Hockey is a wonderful sport, but the culture around hockey does need to change. There are so many things that could be made better in this world, and Shane, Ilia, and Scott Hunter are great examples of people who would benefit from those changes being made. And for us as an audience, as we see ourselves in these characters, as we see them being loved, as we see them being cared for, there is a moment of impact of being able to see yourself on screen being loved in a way that feels out loud and genuine. And while I've probably gotten a little bit more sappy and personal in this episode than I have in previous ones, I do want to say that I think this show has made a really big difference to me personally, and that watching it make this level of impact for so many people that I've seen online and just in my personal life has been such a privilege. I think that this show came at exactly the right time for so many people, and I can't wait to see what it does for the rest of the world as it continues to roll out, as more people continue to find it, and as season 2 and the new book Unrivaled come out. So while we are done with episode 6 and season 1, this is not the last that we'll talk about this show. There are a couple of things I want to preview for you that will be on this channel moving forward. First, next week, my show You Are What You Love comes back. In that show, I have people come in and talk about the piece of media that changed their lives, which feels pretty relevant to this episode. We have talked about so many different pieces of media, and just to preview a few that are coming this season, I talked about Star Wars The Force Awakens with Jen Markham, who is an incredible cosplayer. We did, of course, talk about Heated Rivalry with a friend of mine who is a comedian named Erin Chalakian, who we actually met through the Heated Rivalry comedy show that she hosted. We talked about The Amazing Spider-Man with a friend of mine named Yuvi, who's an amazing content creator. And for another episode that I'm really excited about, we talk about hockey as an entire piece of media with Lexi LaFleur Brown, who is a hockey romance author. We also talk a little bit about her debut novel, Shoot Your Shot, as well as her upcoming book, Evening the Score. So if you want to hear more conversation about Heated Rivalry, about hockey, and about other pieces of media, be sure to subscribe now so that you don't miss that next week. And that show will air every Wednesday, so you can always come back for that. And of course, I will still be continuing these hockey romance and other sports romance breakdowns and giving you the context behind it. And since a very big show is coming out next week off campus, we will also start breaking those down episode by episode. So if you are a fan of those books, or you're very excited for the TV show, or both, if you have any questions that you're hoping I'll cover in the pilot, be sure to drop those down in the comments of this video and I'll make sure to include them. And it has been requested that I do the Heated Rivalry books as well as the TV show, so I will be planning to do those down the line. And of course, I'll still be doing sports breakdowns, commentary, and kind of taking you through the rest of the NHL and the PWHL playoffs, explaining sports in a way that is accessible to you, and of course, always talking about the crossover between sports and pop culture. Because at my core, I will always be a fangirl, and I'm just thrilled that I found a way to make a professional career out of it. So if any or all of that sounds exciting to you, be sure to subscribe, and thank you for joining me for all 6 episodes of Heated Rivalry. I'll see you next week for You Are What You Love and for Off Campus Episode 1.